they came to be healed, but left with nightmares. Welcome to Warm Leaves. I am your host, Raven. Tell me where you're listening from. Your voices keep these mysteries alive. Now let's unlock the truth. It was the kind of morning that made St. Mary Mead look too perfect. Golden sunlight spilling across tidy hedgerows, dew glistening on roses, and the faint hum of bees making their daily rounds. It was a scene that would have seemed untouched by crime, if not for the fact that the vicar's wife, Mrs. Richards, had just burst into Miss Marple's garden in a state of pale disarray. "Miss Marple, oh, it's terrible. You must come at once." The old lady looked up from her knitting with mild surprise. "Oh dear, has something happened?" Mrs. Richards' hands were trembling, her voice shaking. "It's Mr. Allenby. They've found him in his study, locked from the inside, and he's dead." Miss Marple set down her knitting quietly, her expression unreadable, but her eyes alert. "Dead, you say? How very unfortunate. Shall we go at once?" They crossed the green swiftly, the usual morning gossip and market chatter replaced by anxious whispers. When they arrived at the Allenby home, Inspector Craythorne, young, capable, but occasionally inclined toward premature conclusions, was already there, pacing outside the study door. "Miss Marple," he said with a polite nod, though his tone carried a hint of impatience. "I'm afraid this is a most puzzling case. No sign of forced entry, and the room was locked from within. He's been shot, yet the pistol is missing, entirely vanished." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly, her keen eyes scanning the door. "And no one saw anyone leave?" "No one. The windows are barred from the inside, and the only key was in his pocket." Inside, the room smelled faintly of cigar smoke and old books. Mr. Allenby slumped over his desk, the back of his chair turned toward the door. Blood had seeped into the blotter beneath him. The shelves were untouched, the papers on his desk neatly stacked, save for one curious detail: a playing card, the Queen of Hearts, lay face up beside his hand. "A Queen of Hearts," Miss Marple murmured softly. "How charming." Craythorne frowned. "We think it may be some sort of message from the killer, but it's meaningless. Allenby wasn't a gambling man. He never played cards at all." Miss Marple made no comment, but her fingers brushed the edge of the desk thoughtfully. There were no signs of a struggle, and the study appeared untouched. Too untouched. In the hallway, the household staff waited nervously. Mrs. Allenby, pale and composed, stood with a handkerchief clutched tightly in her hand. "I can't imagine who would harm my husband," she said softly, her eyes downcast. "He was a private man. He had no enemies." Miss Marple's eyes flickered toward her, noting the faintest tremor in her voice. "Sometimes, my dear, it is not an enemy who commits such a deed," she said gently. Over the next hours, Craythorne took statements from each member of the household. The cook had been in the kitchen preparing breakfast. The maid had been polishing silver in the dining room. Mrs. Allenby claimed she had been tending to correspondence in her own room. All insisted they heard nothing unusual, no gunshot, no disturbance. It was strange indeed, Miss Marple thought, that no one heard a firearm discharged in such a small house. She asked to see the study again, lingering this time near the window. A faint mark on the sill caught her attention. A thin smudge of soot, almost invisible unless one looked for it. "Curious," she murmured, touching it lightly. "Something?" Craythorne asked. "Oh, perhaps nothing," she said, though her tone suggested otherwise. "But I wonder, if one wished to make a death seem impossible, one might rely upon assumptions. People often assume that if they see a door locked, it must have been locked from within." That evening, Miss Marple returned home, her mind turning over each detail. The Queen of Hearts, the missing pistol, the silent shot, none of it quite fit together. Yet she had the distinct feeling that the solution was disarmingly simple, concealed beneath layers of misdirection. She thought again of the Allenbys, of the way Mrs. Allenby had kept her eyes lowered, her voice calm. A devoted wife, or someone very careful to appear as one. The Queen of Hearts might not be random at all, but rather an illusion. A subtle message, or perhaps a private joke, that would be meaningless to anyone but the person it was meant to reach. The next morning, a new piece of information arrived. The village postmaster recalled seeing Mr. Allenby receive a small parcel only 2 days prior, wrapped in brown paper, no return address. Its contents were unknown, but Mr. Allenby had taken it directly into his study and locked the door. By now, Craythorne was growing impatient. "We've no weapon, no suspect, and no means. I don't see how the case can be solved." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. "Oh, my dear Inspector, I do believe you underestimate how simple murder can be, when one is clever enough to make it appear impossible." She asked for one final examination of the study. This time she moved directly to the fireplace, noting the faint odor of burnt powder. Something had been fired here. Not a bullet, perhaps, but a mechanism of some sort. On the mantelpiece sat a small porcelain vase. She lifted it carefully, finding beneath it a tiny metal spring, scorched along one edge. "Ah," she said softly. "So that is where you went, my little friend." Craythorne looked baffled. "What is that?" Miss Marple replaced the vase delicately. "A spring from a very clever device. One that could discharge a small firearm remotely and then be dismantled or destroyed in the fire. As for the Queen of Hearts, well, I should think it was placed there deliberately. A warning to someone who would recognize its meaning." Her eyes fell once more on Mrs. Allenby, who had been standing quietly in the doorway. The woman's face was pale, but her composure was cracking. "I believe," Miss Marple said gently, "that Mr. Allenby's death was not the work of an intruder, nor was it spontaneous. It was the result of careful planning by someone who understood him well enough to know he would lock himself in, someone who had access to the room beforehand." Mrs. Allenby's voice trembled. "That's absurd. Why would I—" "Because, my dear," Miss Marple said softly, "he was planning to ruin you. The Queen of Hearts was from a deck kept in your sitting room, his way of reminding you of the love he once professed before turning it to cruelty. I think you decided you would not allow him the chance." There was a long, tense silence. Craythorne stepped forward. Mrs. Allenby's composure faltered entirely, her hand tightening around the handkerchief as if it might shield her. Miss Marple did not gloat, nor did she press further. She had seen such things before, a seemingly perfect life, and a single act born from years of quiet desperation. The law would take its course. As they left the Allenby home, Craythorne shook his head. "I don't know how you saw it, Miss Marple. It seemed impossible." Miss Marple smiled faintly, her knitting needles clicking once more in her lap as she returned to her garden. "My dear Inspector, in life as in knitting, the pattern is always there. One only has to look closely enough to see it." The next morning in St. Mary Mead was quieter than the last, though the tension that hung over the Allenby home had not lessened. Word of the murder traveled in hushed tones through the village, and the more elaborate the theories, the more content people seemed to be. Miss Marple, however, was far from satisfied. A confession, if one came at all, did not always equal the truth, and there were still threads of the tapestry that had yet to be pulled. Inspector Craythorne had taken Mrs. Allenby into custody the evening before, and although he considered the matter settled, Miss Marple knew enough to keep her knitting needles idle that morning. It was too soon, too neat, too expected. She decided to pay another informal call to the scene, her manner as mild as ever, though her mind was busy. The constable at the door allowed her in without fuss. Craythorne had long since learned that the old lady's visits tended to yield more progress than interference. The study had been cleared of Mr. Allenby's body, but the faint scent of gunpowder still lingered, mixing unpleasantly with the smell of aged paper. Miss Marple's eyes drifted over the desk again, pausing not on the obvious, the absence of the pistol, the playing card, but on the arrangement of the papers. They were stacked neatly, except for a single folded letter lying almost imperceptibly out of line with the others. She picked it up delicately, her eyes scanning the address. It was unsigned and bore no name of the sender, but the handwriting was unusually bold for the kind of genteel correspondence the Allenbys usually exchanged. Just then, Craythorne entered, his hat in hand, clearly surprised to find her there. "Miss Marple, I see you've returned. Still chasing the same suspicion?" She smiled faintly. "Only tying up loose ends, Inspector. Such things bother me terribly. And you know, one never likes to leave a pattern incomplete." Craythorne sighed, but allowed her to continue, leaning against the door frame. "If you're looking for the weapon, we've searched high and low. It's not here. I'm certain Mrs. Allenby hid it before we arrived." Miss Marple set the letter back on the desk, her expression mild. Perhaps, though it is curious that no one saw her carry anything. Even the most discreet woman cannot make a firearm vanish without trace, unless, of course, it was never meant to be found. Craythorne raised an eyebrow. "You think someone else might have taken it?" She did not answer directly, but glanced toward the bookshelf, her sharp eyes catching a small disturbance. A thin layer of dust covered most of the upper shelves, save for a faint streak where a book had been recently moved. She reached up and drew it out, a dull green volume on legal contracts, entirely ordinary at first glance. But as she opened it, a faint residue of ash drifted to the carpet. "How strange," she murmured softly. Craythorne stepped closer. "What is it?" "Nothing conclusive," she said, returning the book to its place. "Only that people rarely handle such volumes unless they have a reason. And Mr. Allenby, I think, had reasons that extended beyond his study." Her visit to the kitchen followed, where the cook was scrubbing pots with unnecessary vigor. "Terrible business," the woman said without prompting. "And poor Mrs. Allenby, she wasn't herself at all these past weeks. Always jumpy like she expected something." Miss Marple nodded kindly, filing that away. "Did you notice anything unusual the day before his death?" The cook hesitated. "Only the delivery, ma'am. That parcel the master got. But that's nothing, is it?" Miss Marple thanked her and moved to the hallway, where the maid was dusting the banister. The girl startled slightly at seeing her. "Goodness, Miss Marple, I didn't expect you. I suppose you want to ask questions like the inspector." "Only one or two, my dear," Miss Marple said gently. "It's such a dreadful thing when someone is taken so suddenly. Did you happen to notice where Mr. Allenby went after receiving his parcel?" The maid looked nervous. "Straight to his study, as always. But he seemed different, like he was relieved about something." "Relieved." Miss Marple filed the word away like a pin in a cushion. Back in her own sitting room later, she turned these details over while her knitting needles clicked in a steady rhythm. The parcel, the relieved demeanor, the oddly disturbed book, the letter with no signature. Each detail was small on its own, but together they suggested a picture that was not yet clear, yet far more complex than the inspector assumed. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Craythorne again, looking faintly vexed. "Miss Marple, you won't believe this. Someone's broken into the Allenby study during the night. Nothing seems to be stolen, but the place was disturbed." "Ah," she said softly, rising from her chair. "Then it seems we are not the only ones tying up loose ends, Inspector. I think I should very much like to see what our visitor was looking for." When they arrived, the study bore subtle but definite changes. Papers shuffled, a desk drawer slightly ajar. Miss Marple moved quietly around the room, her fingers brushing the edge of the chair where Allenby had died. Something new caught her attention, a tiny chip of porcelain on the carpet near the fireplace, almost invisible against the patterned rug. She bent to retrieve it, holding it delicately between thumb and forefinger. "The vase," she murmured. It was moved, or perhaps broken. Craythorne looked puzzled. "We searched that fireplace already. Nothing there." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly, "which suggests someone feared what might still be hidden there, and came back to be certain it was gone." Her eyes drifted toward the window then, where the faint smudge of soot she had noticed before had been partially wiped away. That, more than anything, told her someone had been here who knew exactly what to look for. In that moment, Miss Marple felt the first clear shape of deception. Emerging, not the full picture, not yet, but enough to know the crime had layers the inspector's straightforward approach would miss. Someone else had a stake in this. Someone careful enough to revisit a locked crime scene in the dark of night. She glanced back at Craythorne, her voice mild but certain. "Inspector, I think it is time we stop thinking of this as a closed circle of suspects. The real question is not only who killed Mr. Allenby, but who else feared what he might leave behind." Inspector Craythorne, bolstered by Miss Marple's quiet insistence that the case was far from finished, began questioning the Allenby circle once again. This time he allowed Miss Marple to sit nearby, her knitting basket resting on her lap. She rarely interrupted, but her pale blue eyes missed nothing, not the words spoken, nor the pauses between them. The maid, Annie, was called in first. She twisted her hands in her apron, clearly nervous under the inspector's questioning. "I told you before, sir, I was polishing silver. I never left the dining room until I heard Mrs. Richards screaming in the street." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. "And yet, my dear," she said gently, "you told me only yesterday that you saw Mr. Allenby take his parcel into the study. Surely you weren't in the dining room all that time." Annie froze, her eyes darting toward the inspector before she stammered, "Well, just for a moment, I stepped into the hallway. I didn't think it was important." Craythorne's voice was sharp. "Why leave that out of your statement?" "I was afraid it would look bad," Annie said in a rush. "I didn't want you thinking I had anything to do with what happened, but I didn't hear a shot, I swear." Miss Marple's gaze was thoughtful. Annie might have left something out, but her fear was of suspicion, not guilt. Still, the inconsistency was noted. Next came the cook, Mrs. Davies, who marched in with her chin high. "It's no use questioning me again. I told you what I know, and I've meals to prepare. That man," she gestured toward the absent Mr. Allenby, "was a difficult one, and not worth all this fuss, if you ask me." "That's a curious thing to say about a man recently murdered," Craythorne said, his brow furrowing. Mrs. Davies snorted. "You didn't work for him. He kept secrets. There were arguments late at night when he thought no one could hear." Miss Marple's voice was as mild as ever. "And who was he arguing with, dear?" The cook hesitated, then said, "Once or twice I thought it was Mrs. Allenby, but another time I could swear it was a man's voice." Craythorne's eyes narrowed. "And you're certain of that?" "As certain as I am of my own name, but I didn't see who it was." Miss Marple tucked this away in her mind. A man's voice in the Allenby house. Someone with access. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Richards, was next. She sat primly, hands folded, but her voice was just a shade too eager as she repeated her story of finding the body. "It was dreadful, truly dreadful," she said. "I came straight to fetch Miss Marple, of course. I knew she would know what to do." "You arrived remarkably quickly," Miss Marple remarked quietly. Mrs. Richards flushed slightly. "Well, I do walk past the Allenby home most mornings. It is on my way to the grocer's." "Indeed," Miss Marple said. "And yet the grocer says you never arrived that day." The vicar's wife's lips parted in surprise, and she smoothed her skirt unnecessarily. "Oh, well, I must have turned back after I saw the commotion. It was all rather confusing." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Yes, I expect it was." Craythorne looked from one woman to the other, but chose not to press the matter further. Yet, finally, Mrs. Allenby was brought in from her temporary holding. She was pale but composed, her voice calm as she answered the inspector's questions. "I've told you all I know, Inspector. My husband kept many matters from me. I had no reason to wish him harm." Miss Marple's voice was soft but persistent. "And yet, my dear, you seemed relieved after his death. Not happy, perhaps, but freed from something. I wonder if that is because you knew more of his dealings than you care to admit." Mrs. Allenby's eyes flickered, just for a second. "You're mistaken, Miss Marple. I grieve for my husband. Whatever faults he had, he was still my husband." It was a practiced answer, Miss Marple thought, but not a natural one, and the Queen of Hearts still lingered in her mind, the symbol of love twisted into something else. When Mrs. Allenby was led away, Craythorne exhaled heavily. "Half of them are lying, the other half are hiding something, but none of it gets us any closer to the truth." "Oh, I wouldn't say that, Inspector," Miss Marple said, rising slowly. "People's stories, when they shift, are like threads. Pull the right one and the whole weave comes loose." As they left the station, Miss Marple paused to look back toward the quiet lane where the Allenby house stood. Each person's account had contradicted another's in some small way. Annie's hallway visit, the cook's overheard arguments, Mrs. Richards' unexplained presence, Mrs. Allenby's measured composure. It was a chorus of voices, all playing their parts, but none in perfect harmony. Miss Marple adjusted her hat, her eyes thoughtful. Somewhere in that discord lay the truth, and she intended to hear it clearly before the final note was played. The August afternoon lay heavy over St. Mary Mead, the village wrapped in the languid hum of bees and the distant creak of garden gates. Yet beneath the seeming calm, the murder of Mr. Allenby stirred currents of speculation and quiet unease. In her cottage, Miss Marple sat by the window, her knitting set aside for once, a small notebook open in her lap. On its pages she had drawn a web of names, each suspect a knot, each contradiction a thin thread connecting them. Annie, the maid, nervous, evasive. She had altered her account of where she was that morning, and her anxiety seemed disproportionate to her role. Miss Marple underlined her name lightly, but did not circle it. Fear, yes, but perhaps the fear of someone who had seen more than she should. Mrs. Davies, the cook. Resentful, outspoken, and claiming to have overheard arguments in the dead of night. Her detail of a man's voice was particularly interesting. Greed, revenge, or simply a desire to be rid of a difficult employer. Mrs. Richards, the vicar's wife. Too eager, too quick to place herself at the scene. Her path to the grocer was no such thing. Jealousy, gossip often masked deeper intentions. Mrs. Allenby, composed to the point of calculation. Her life, once tied to a man who seemed to keep more secrets than friends, was now hers to command. Freedom could be a powerful motive, though it was rarely as clean as it appeared. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her eyes narrowing slightly as she considered the tangle. It was not enough to know each person's motive. She had to understand the interplay, how each motive brushed against the others. She began walking through them in sequence, much as she might untangle skeins of yarn. Annie's fear. Could it be linked to Mrs. Richards's convenient arrival? Perhaps the maid had seen something at the study door or overheard a conversation. The nervousness could be less about guilt and more about danger of speaking out, Mrs. Davies's overheard arguments. If a man's voice was present, who could it have been? No tradesman had been announced that evening, nor was there any sign of visitors, unless the visitor had entered unseen, or was someone who could come and go without question. Mrs. Richards' swift appearance, before the alarm was fully raised, troubled Miss Marple most. A woman who happened to be at the right place, at the right time, too many times, was rarely there by accident. And Mrs. Allenby. She had shown no curiosity about the investigation, no outrage at her arrest, no concern over the whispers about her name. Such detachment could be grief or relief. Miss Marple set her cup down, her mind flicking back to the peculiar details, the Queen of Hearts card, the unsigned letter, the missing weapon, the chipped porcelain near the fireplace. None of these yet fit neatly together. A gentle knock came at her door. It was Inspector Craythorne, looking as though he had been wrestling with the case as much as she had. "Miss Marple, I've been over their alibis twice," he said without preamble. "None of them line up perfectly, but none of them are broken clean enough to arrest someone. It's like every one of them has just enough truth to pass muster." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Ah, but Inspector, that is precisely the difficulty with lies. The best ones are never whole cloth. They are patchwork stitched with threads of truth. Tell me, what did you find when you checked the delivery records for that parcel?" He looked startled. "How did you—" "Well, there was no sender's name. Just a London posting. Could have been anyone. And the contents? Destroyed, it seems. Whatever was in it, we've found nothing." Miss Marple's eyes brightened slightly. "How very interesting. A delivery from London, a hidden book, a letter without a signature, and a man's voice in the house the night before. These things, Inspector, are seldom unconnected." They walked together toward the Allenby house again, where Miss Marple took her time strolling through the garden. She stopped by the roses, noticing a single crushed bloom at the edge of the path. Such damage suggested someone had been there in haste, someone who did not wish to be seen entering by the door. Inside, she moved through the rooms, her eyes flicking over small domestic details. A drawer locked that had not been before, a vase moved slightly out of position. At each change, she added another thread to the web in her mind. Greed, as if the delivery had contained money, or proof of a debt paid. Someone might have wanted it. Revenge. If Mr. Allenby's dealings had hurt someone close, anger could have been the spark. Jealousy, if affection or promises had been involved. Fear, if the truth of Allenby's secrets threatened more than one reputation. As she stood in the study again, her gaze fell once more on the bookshelf. She pulled the green legal volume free, this time turning its pages more slowly. A thin slip of paper fell out, half burned, its words incomplete. "Will be enough to ensure silence. The card will remind you." Miss Marple's expression did not change, but the quiet satisfaction in her eyes deepened. A will, a payment, and the Queen of Hearts as a reminder. That card was not random at all. She replaced the paper carefully and turned to Craythorne. "Inspector, I believe each of our suspects has told us a piece of the truth. Now we must see which piece fits where, and which pieces belong to someone else entirely." The inspector frowned. "You mean one of them is covering for another?" Miss Marple's smile was faint. "Or for themselves in a way that is not obvious. But the web is tightening, Inspector. We need only one more tug to see which thread unravels first." Inspector Craythorne looked unusually buoyant when he arrived at Miss Marple's cottage the next morning, a rolled document clutched under his arm. His usual furrowed brow was smoothed, and there was a confident light in his eyes. "We've got it, Miss Marple," he announced, not even waiting to be invited in. "The missing link. A witness has come forward. Someone who saw Mrs. Allenby leaving the study shortly before the body was found. And that's not all. We've recovered the revolver from the hedge behind the garden wall. Her fingerprints are on it. This should settle matters." Miss Marple, still seated at her small writing desk, looked up mildly from her knitting pattern. "How very efficient," she said, as though commenting on a well-polished silver tray. "And who is this witness?" "A delivery boy from the grocer. Said he was cutting across the lane and saw her at the study window, looking flustered." Miss Marple's needles clicked once before she set them gently in her lap. Curious that this witness took so long to remember. Grocers' boys usually recall such things immediately. especially when the whole village is talking of nothing else. Craythorne waved a hand. You've said yourself the simplest answers are often the right ones. She had motive, means, and now opportunity. I'll see her charged before the week's out. Miss Marple's gaze rested on him a moment longer, a faint smile at the corners of her lips. Yes, Inspector, you will have your victory. But I do hope it is the correct one. The next hours unfolded in a haze of official efficiency. Mrs. Allenby was taken into custody again, this time with more formality. The villagers nodded knowingly in the lanes, and even the vicar's wife remarked that it was a relief to have the matter so neatly concluded. But Miss Marple was not relieved. She returned to the Allenby house once more, this time on the pretext of collecting her umbrella, which she had most certainly not forgotten. The rooms felt different now, emptier, quieter. The study in particular bore the air of a stage after the final curtain, the audience gone, the actors dispersed. And yet something was out of tune. Her eyes wandered to the bookshelf again, where the green legal volume had been replaced exactly as before. Too exactly. She pulled it free, leafing through it. The half-burnt note was gone. She replaced the book slowly, her brow faintly furrowed. In the hallway, she paused, glancing at the crushed rose bush beneath the study window. A revolver could indeed be thrown there, she thought. But the placement, it had always seemed to her the sort of thing a person wanted to be found. And Mrs. Allenby, whatever else she might be, was not careless. On her way back, Miss Marple stopped at the grocer's to buy tea. With casual interest, she inquired about the new witness. Mr. Tucker, the grocer, raised his eyebrows. No boy of mine's been over to the Allenby place that day, and if he had, I'd have known. We've been short-staffed this week. Miss Marple's eyes lit faintly, though she made no sign. How very odd. The inspector must have been mistaken. That evening, at home, she sat with her notebook open again, crossing no one's name from her web. A planted weapon, a manufactured witness. Someone was very determined to see Mrs. Allenby take the blame. Too determined. The next morning, the newspaper announced the arrest in bold letters. Wife of local gentleman to stand trial for murder. The village felt lighter somehow, as though a tension had been relieved. And yet Miss Marple knew better. When something is neatly tied with a bow in St. Mary Mead, it is often to conceal the untidy truth beneath. 2 days later, Craythorne stopped by once more, triumphant still. We've done it, Miss Marple. The case is closed. We'll have her in court in a fortnight. You were right all along. It was someone close to the victim. Miss Marple smiled faintly, pouring him tea. Perhaps. But I cannot help but feel, Inspector, that the real killer is waiting in the wings, and we have only brought the understudy to the stage. Craythorne frowned. What are you suggesting? That the person who arranged for the revolver to be found, and for a witness to appear, was not acting out of charity. They were ensuring that your attention was fixed elsewhere. The inspector looked uneasy. If you're right, Miss Marple, then, she interrupted softly, we have given the real criminal time, and time is precisely what such people require to act again or to disappear entirely. We must be very careful, Inspector. A false victory is far more dangerous than no victory at all. As she saw him out, Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the lane. Somewhere in the village, someone was listening, waiting, perhaps even smiling to themselves at the success of their plan. The web had not unraveled yet. It had only been drawn tighter, and the final tug was still to come. The August evening settled soft and golden over St. Mary Mead, but in Miss Marple's cottage the air felt heavier, almost expectant. She sat in her usual chair, tea cooling beside her, her knitting untouched. Her eyes rested not on the present case, but on something much older, like a thread tugging at the corner of her memory. It was the half-burned note that had stirred it. The card will remind you. Such a phrase was not casual. She had heard it before, years ago, in connection with a case most had long since forgotten. A certain Mr. Latham, a discreet solicitor, had used playing cards as his private reminders, marks of promises, threats, and debts. That case had ended in scandal, though quietly buried, and Mr. Latham had once been in correspondence with Mr. Allenby. Miss Marple rose from her chair, crossing to her small bureau where she kept old newspaper clippings. It took little time to find the one she sought. Local solicitor leaves practice. Abruptly. Financial irregularities suspected. The article was sparse, but a name leapt from the page. Mrs. Richards, then plain Miss Ellis, had been mentioned in passing as a close family friend of the Lathams. How curious. The next morning, she walked to the vicarage under the guise of delivering a jar of her famous quince jelly. Mrs. Richards received her with her usual effusiveness, though her eyes darted as though measuring how much Miss Marple knew. "You must be relieved about the arrest," Mrs. Richards said brightly. "Justice so quickly done. It's quite reassuring, isn't it?" Miss Marple sipped her tea with a serene smile. "Oh, indeed. It does remind me so much of the Latham affair. Do you recall it?" The faintest tremor passed over Mrs. Richards' expression. "The Lathams? Why, that was years ago. Well, I did know Mrs. Latham slightly. Such a tragedy for them both." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes twinkling faintly. "Yes, quite. I remember how very loyal their friends were, even when rather difficult matters came to light." Mrs. Richards' fingers tightened just a little on her teacup. Later that day, Miss Marple called on Inspector Craythorne. She placed the clipping on his desk. "Do you suppose, Inspector, that we might look into whether Mr. Allenby had dealings with Mr. Latham's firm, and perhaps whether Mrs. Richards's maiden name appears in those records?" Craythorne raised a brow. "You think there's a connection?" Miss Marple's voice was mild. "In my experience, Inspector, crimes in small villages are rather like old debts. They are rarely paid in full, and they have a tendency to come due again." The records came slowly, but when they arrived, they were illuminating. Mr. Allenby had indeed been a client of Mr. Latham's firm. More intriguing still, a note in the files suggested a sum of money held in trust had vanished. The trustee named was a Miss Ellis. Miss Marple sat back, her fingers lightly clasped. So, a sum of money missing, a connection to both the deceased and one of our most helpful witnesses, and a card that promises a reminder. Craythorne frowned. "You think Richards is involved in this? She's the vicar's wife." "Precisely," Miss Marple interrupted softly. "It is the safest position for someone who needs to be above suspicion, and perhaps someone has been reminding her of what she owes." But there was more to it than that. The delivery from London, the burned note, the green legal volume, they were all relics of a conversation that began years earlier. That evening, Miss Marple made her way quietly to the Allenby house again. The study was locked, but Mrs. Davies let her in under the pretext of retrieving a forgotten handkerchief. Inside, she went directly to the desk drawers. In the bottom drawer, beneath neatly arranged correspondence, she found a bundle of older letters tied with a faded ribbon. The handwriting matched that of the half-burned note, Mr. Latham's hand. Most were routine legal matters, but two stood out. The first hinted at certain obligations due in the event of silence not being maintained. The second enclosed a playing card, the Queen of Hearts. Miss Marple placed the letters back exactly as she had found them, her mind clear now on one point. The present crime was not born of sudden passion. It was the final movement of a scheme long in motion, rooted in promises and betrayals buried in the past. As she left the house, the shadows in the garden stretched long, whispering of debts yet unpaid. Somewhere in St. Mary Mead, someone was watching, aware that their carefully hidden history was beginning to surface. The past had returned, and Miss Marple knew the present would soon follow its lead. The following morning, Miss Marple seemed far more interested in her geraniums than in murder. She spent an hour fussing over the flower pots on her front step, humming softly, before making her way to the vicarage. Anyone watching might have thought it a purely social visit. Mrs. Richards was in the garden, pruning roses with her usual precision. "Miss Marple, what a lovely surprise." "Do come in for tea," she said, her tone warm, her eyes sharp. "Thank you, my dear, but I won't keep you long," Miss Marple replied cheerfully. "I've been going through some old things at home. Such a nuisance when one comes across keepsakes one can't quite place." She produced a small envelope from her handbag. Inside, visible through the open flap, was a playing card, the Queen of Hearts. Mrs. Richards' hands paused mid-snipping. It was only a heartbeat, but the stillness was telling. She recovered quickly, giving a polite little laugh. What an odd thing to keep, a card of all things. Miss Marple tilted her head innocently. "Oh, quite. I only thought it might have belonged to someone else. Someone who might remember its significance. Cards do turn up in the most inconvenient places, don't they? I found this one tucked inside an old legal volume. Such untidy habits some people have." Mrs. Richards' smile held, but there was a flicker, just enough to confirm Miss Marple's suspicion. A well-composed woman, Mrs. Richards was, but no one could erase the memory of an old debt with a single polite laugh. Miss Marple let the silence linger a moment too long before slipping the envelope back into her bag. "Well, I'll leave you to your roses. I dare say I'll find the rightful owner in due course." That afternoon, Miss Marple staged her second little test, this time for Mr. Davies, the vicar's curate, who had been curiously silent since the murder. She invited him for tea under the pretext of asking his advice about a church charity. The moment he arrived, she had a tray waiting, 3 cups, as though expecting another guest. "Oh dear," she murmured, glancing at the extra place. "I must have forgotten that Mrs. Richards isn't coming. It must be force of habit, you know, seeing her so often in the vicarage. I even prepared her favorite biscuits." Davies hesitated, his eyes darting toward the plate. She doesn't eat these any longer," he said too quickly before catching himself. "That is, so I've heard." Miss Marple gave him a kindly look. "How thoughtful of you to notice such small changes. I dare say you know the vicarage household very well indeed." Davies flushed, fumbling for a sip of tea. That evening, Miss Marple noted 2 things in her little book. 1. Mrs. Richards reacts with discomfort to the Queen of Hearts. 2. Davies knows details of the Richards household he should not, unless unusually attentive. The next morning, she paid an unannounced visit to Inspector Craythorne. On his desk, she set down an old deck of cards, worn at the edges. "Would you be so good as to ask Mrs. Richards if she recalls losing one of these?" Craythorne frowned. "You're playing games now." "Not games, Inspector," she said mildly. "A simple test of memory. I believe we shall see a reaction worth noting." Sure enough, when Mrs. Richards was summoned and shown the deck, her hands trembled ever so slightly as she turned the cards over, pausing fractionally longer at the Queen of Hearts. She smiled politely, of course, but it was the sort of smile that cost her effort. As she left the station, Miss Marple caught Craythorne's doubtful eye. "Sometimes, Inspector, it is not what a person says, but what they cannot help feeling when confronted with an object from their past. Cards are excellent for such purposes. They have a habit of revealing the hand one hoped to keep hidden. And indeed, Miss Marple's own hand was nearly complete. A card, a missing sum of money, a murder, and a woman with the steadiest nerves in the parish. Until now. One small crack had appeared. And cracks, Miss Marple knew, had a way of widening until the truth spilled through. The morning broke with a thin mist curling along the hedgerows, the sort of weather Miss Marple always felt sharpened tempers. She arrived at the police station as arranged, her manner calm, but her mind alive with quiet anticipation. Today she intended to show Inspector Craythorne the bundle of Latham's old letters she had discovered in Allenby's desk, the kind of thing that, in the right light, could unravel a very stubborn knot. But when Craythorne opened the evidence drawer, his expression darkened. "They're gone," he muttered. He rifled through the compartment twice, though it was already plain the packet wasn't there. "I locked this myself last night." Miss Marple's blue eyes narrowed ever so slightly. "How very odd. And the key?" He tapped his breast pocket. "On me since yesterday. No one's touched it." Her knitting bag rested lightly on her lap, though she wasn't knitting. "If the letters have vanished," she said quietly, "then someone knows precisely how dangerous they were. That suggests two things. One, the culprit has a great deal of access, and two, they are rather desperate." The inspector swore under his breath and ordered the constable to search the station. Nothing turned up. Miss Marple's mind went to the vicarage at once. There were few people with the ability and the confidence to slip into such places unnoticed. Her thoughts returned to Mrs. Richards, always so eager to present herself as helpful and blameless. Later that day, Miss Marple walked to the vicarage with her usual air of pleasant distraction. She found Mrs. Richards arranging hymn books in the church, her movements perfectly ordinary. Too ordinary. "I had such a frightful surprise this morning," Miss Marple remarked casually, slipping into a pew as if resting her feet. "The letters from Mr. Latham's office have vanished. The very ones tied with that charming ribbon. Imagine such disorder in an official place." Mrs. Richards's fingers paused briefly on the hymn books, the slightest hesitation before continuing. "What a pity. But I suppose that sort of thing happens often in busy offices." "Oh yes," Miss Marple agreed serenely, "though it usually requires someone who knows exactly what to take and where to look." She smiled gently, as if discussing the weather. That evening, Miss Marple found another, subtler loss. The Queen of Hearts card she had been carrying in her knitting bag was gone. Only the faintest crease in the fabric suggested someone had reached in. She did not mention it to the inspector. Instead, she returned home, sat by her window, and reflected. Whoever had taken the evidence was working with care, but also with urgency. And more troublingly, they were willing to remove anything that could link the past to the present. She glanced toward the vicarage, at its windows glowing warm in the dusk. Somewhere inside, the person she suspected most was making tea, smiling at the vicar, perhaps even saying prayers aloud. But Miss Marple knew that prayers and polished manners had hidden more than one crime before. The evidence might be gone, but the truth had not vanished with it. And now the thief had made a critical mistake. They had shown her just how afraid they were. The village awoke to a shock that spread like frost over the hedgerows. Early that morning, the vicarage maid had run, pale and shaking, to fetch the doctor. Mr. Davies, the curate, had been found in the vestry, slumped over the communion table, cold to the touch. A single cup of tea stood on the sideboard, untouched but faintly scented with something sharp and bitter. Miss Marple arrived at the church just as Inspector Craythorne was ushering everyone back. The scene was quiet now, save for the whispers of a few parishioners gathered beyond the lich gate. Craythorne muttered grimly, "Same method as Allenby. Poison. But this time, there's no mystery about how it was administered. Whoever brewed that tea intended Davies to drink it, and no one else." Miss Marple's eyes softened as she looked at the still figure being carried from the vestry. Poor young man. He was only a danger because he knew too much. Craythorne frowned. Knew too much? About what? She didn't answer directly. Her mind was already sorting through the threads. Davies had been nervous during their last conversation, far too aware of the Richards household, far too jumpy when the Queen of Hearts was mentioned. If he had been silenced, it was because he had either tried to tell someone what he suspected or threatened the wrong person. The second death changed everything. Whoever had killed Allenby was no longer merely covering an old debt. They were now protecting themselves against anyone who might betray them, and if they were willing to act again, they would not hesitate to strike at others who stood in the way. That afternoon, Miss Marple took her usual walk through the village, stopping at the grocer's, the post office, and finally pausing outside the vicarage. She could see Mrs. Richards through the window, head bowed as she sorted correspondence. Such a picture of composure, yet there was something brittle in the set of her shoulders. At tea with the vicar later, Miss Marple remarked lightly, "It is most fortunate your dear wife was not in the church when poor Mr. Davies was found. Imagine how dreadful that would have been for her." The vicar, distracted and tired, nodded. Yes, though she had planned to meet him there early. Changed her mind at the last minute. Miss Marple stirred her tea slowly, her eyes thoughtful. How very wise of her. That night she wrote a letter, a brief, precise note addressed to Inspector Craythorne, warning him that the killer was becoming bolder and that the next move might not be delayed long. She sealed it carefully. For the first time since the case began, Miss Marple felt the cold edge of time pressing against her. The killer was still at large, still poised to act again, and now the game was no longer simply about solving a murder. It was about stopping the next one before it happened, and she knew, beyond doubt, that she herself might be the next obstacle in the villain's path. It was a quiet afternoon in St. Mary Mead, the kind of calm that always seemed to follow disaster. Villagers whispered at shop counters, glancing toward the vicarage as if it had sprouted a dark shadow over the green. Miss Marple, as ever, kept her pace unhurried, her eyes alert for the smallest shift in the ordinary. She stopped at the post office to collect a small parcel. Mrs. Pringle, the postmistress, was in a talkative mood. Terrible business, poor Mr. Davies. Such a quiet young man, though I must say he was in here the day before, sending a letter to London. Odd time for correspondence, don't you think? Miss Marple tilted her head. Did he now? How very conscientious of him, and did he pay in cash? Mrs. Pringle nodded. A single shilling, exact change. I noticed because he used a brand new coin. Quite unusual, shiny as if it had never been touched. A new coin. That was curious. Miss Marple thanked Mrs. Pringle and walked home with a mind quietly buzzing. A new coin, a Queen of Hearts, and Mrs. Richards' perfectly timed absence from the vestry. Small, ordinary details, unless one knew where to look. At home, she sat by her window and let her thoughts settle into their proper order. Coins, cards, and careful absences. It reminded her suddenly of the old case of the Weatherby niece, where the guilty party had used trifles, tokens of no value, to signal to an accomplice when to act. Her knitting lay untouched as she began turning over the sequence of events. Allenby's death, then Davies's. Each accompanied by something seemingly out of place. The card tucked away in a book, the sudden change in someone's schedule, the oddly deliberate loss of evidence. All of them, she realized now, were not random disruptions. They were markers. And there was one person in the village with both the precision and the presence in each location to plant or remove such markers without suspicion. Mrs. Richards. Miss Marple thought of the way Mrs. Richards moved about the vicarage, her access to every room, her habit of tidying papers, even in the church. A woman so careful would not leave poisoned tea by chance, nor risk being present at a second death unless she knew she was safe. The pattern was there, like a faint thread in a piece of lace, only visible if one stepped back, and now Miss Marple could see the whole shape. But she also knew this. Patterns were only useful when timed correctly. She must not act too soon. The killer was precise, methodical, and cornered. To confront her now would be dangerous. Miss Marple set down her tea and reached for her knitting at last. The pattern was clear, but now she needed to weave her own. Miss Marple had seen greed in its various disguises, and she had seen envy wear 100 polite faces. But the motive behind Allenby's death, and now poor Mr. Davies's, was neither quite greed nor jealousy. It was something colder, older, and more deeply rooted in the human heart. The revelation came, oddly enough, through the vicar himself. She had stopped by with a jar of her damson preserves, and he, weary-eyed and distracted, had sat her down for tea. "It's been dreadful," he sighed, rubbing his forehead. "My wife has taken to locking herself in the study, says she's sorting papers for the parish archives. I dare say it's her way of keeping busy, but—" He hesitated, then gave a faint, embarrassed smile. "You know, there's something I've never told you about her. She had a brother, years ago, who was quite the scandal. Involved in some terrible affair with a shipping firm, a disgrace to the family name. She rarely speaks of it." Miss Marple smiled faintly, as if it were a small curiosity. "And this brother's name?" The vicar frowned in thought. "Lawrence. Lawrence Richards. Disappeared after the scandal. Never stood trial. Some say he died abroad. My wife never confirmed it." When Miss Marple walked home, her mind turned that name over like a smooth stone in her palm. Lawrence Richards. A shipping firm. A disgrace never spoken of again. Allenby had been the solicitor handling the firm's bankruptcy, Miss Marple recalled from her conversations with the late man's clerk. Davies, meanwhile, had been preparing papers on old estate holdings, papers that might have revealed just how certain investments were shifted out of sight. It was all of a piece now. The murders were not about recent quarrels, nor about the modest inheritance Allenby had hinted at. They were about obliterating the last traces of Lawrence Richards' disgrace, which could, even now, ruin the vicar's respectable household and his wife's carefully constructed identity. What chilled Miss Marple was not the motive itself. Family loyalty, in its way, could be understood, but the precision and coolness with which Mrs. Richards had acted. There was no sign of passion in the crimes, no moment of desperation. This was the work of someone who had planned, waited, and chosen. Her moments as a gardener chooses when to cut back a plant that grows too wild, and in that stillness, Miss Marple saw the truth. Mrs. Richards was not killing to protect a husband's reputation or to preserve a comfortable home. She was killing to preserve the life she had rebuilt for herself, one that could not bear the weight of Lawrence Richards' shame, should it surface. Allenby had known. Davies had suspected, and Miss Marple, in her quiet way, had just stepped into the same circle of danger. She set her knitting aside. The motive was clear now. What remained was to bring it into the open, before Mrs. Richards decided to protect her secret one last time. The summer evening was deceptively calm, the sunset brushing the vicarage garden with gold. Miss Marple sat on the vicar's terrace, knitting as though nothing more serious than the next parish fete was on her mind. But inside, the stage was set. Inspector Craythorne waited quietly in the study, a plainclothes officer positioned near the back entrance. Mrs. Richards came out carrying the tea tray, her composure as neat as the starched lace at her cuffs. "Do try the Victoria sponge, Miss Marple," she said pleasantly. "It's fresh from the oven." "Such kindness," Miss Marple murmured, accepting a slice. She kept her eyes on her work, letting the silence stretch. One thinks often, you know, how people go to such lengths for the sake of family. Your dear husband is fortunate to have such loyalty. Mrs. Richards' hand paused briefly as she poured the tea. "I've always believed in protecting those I care for." "Quite so," Miss Marple said, her needles clicking softly. "As one would protect a brother, perhaps. Lawrence Richards, for instance." There was the smallest tremor. The teaspoon in Mrs. Richards' hand struck the side of the cup with a sharp ting. She set it down, smiling tightly. "I don't know what you mean." Miss Marple looked up at her, kindly, almost sadly. "But you do, my dear. Allenby knew the truth. Poor Mr. Davies suspected, and both were good men. Neither would have sought to ruin you. But you could not take the risk." Mrs. Richards' eyes hardened, a flicker of calculation passing over her face. "You have no proof." "Ah," Miss Marple said gently. "But that's where you've been so clever, isn't it? Removing the letters, the card, even the records in the vestry. But there is one thing you overlooked." She nodded toward the study door. Inspector Craythorne stepped out, holding a small sealed envelope. "This," he said, "is the letter Mr. Davies sent to London the day before his death. It was held at the sorting office, special request to deliver only if anything happened to him. In it, he names you, Mrs. Richards." Mrs. Richards' lips parted, her breath coming faster. For a moment, she looked as though she might faint. Then her expression changed, a flash of steel replacing fear. "You think you've trapped me?" Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her voice still calm. "My dear, I don't think it. I know it, and I would advise you not to make a foolish last move. It is very hard to explain away desperation." Mrs. Richards' gaze darted toward the back of the garden, but the faint rustle from the officer waiting there stopped her cold. Slowly, she straightened her shoulders, the fight draining from her. "I did it for my family, for my life here. No one will understand that." Miss Marple looked at her with quiet compassion. "Some will. But the truth has a way of surfacing, however deep one tries to bury it. It is always better, my dear, to meet it on one's own feet than to be dragged to it." Mrs. Richards said nothing more as Craythorne stepped forward. The tension broke like a taut string, leaving only the still air of the garden and the soft rustle of Miss Marple gathering her knitting. The case was over, the pattern was complete, and Miss Marple, in her unassuming way, had once again brought a killer to light without ever raising her voice. The village settled into its comfortable rhythm again, as it always did after scandal. Mrs. Richards had been taken away quietly, the vicar pale and stunned, but outwardly dignified. Inspector Craythorne was satisfied. The London papers printed a tidy account of Miss Marple's assistance. It should have ended there. But 3 days later, a letter arrived at Miss Marple's cottage, hand-delivered by a boy from the post office. The handwriting was neat, elegant, not Mrs. Richards. Miss Marple opened it over tea, scanning the brief contents with a slow frown. The letter read, "Dear Miss Marple, you have caught the wrong Richards. My sister is clever, but she could never have managed it alone. You missed the part that mattered, but don't trouble yourself. By the time you read this, I shall be far away." Ah. Miss Marple sat back in her chair, the paper trembling slightly between her fingers. Lawrence Richards. Alive. And bold enough to taunt her. The case she thought closed unfolded again in her mind. Mrs. Richards had motive, certainly, but she lacked one thing, access to certain documents that were never in her possession. Allenby's files had been tampered with before Mrs. Richards entered the vestry. And Davies's letter, how convenient that it arrived just when it would seal her fate. Miss Marple felt a faint chill. The letter hadn't been proof so much as bait. Bait she had believed genuine. That evening she visited the vicarage under the pretense of bringing soup. The vicar, subdued and worn, thanked her absently. His study was a mess. Parish records scattered, drawers half open. "Packing?" Miss Marple asked gently. "Yes, there are so many things to sort. My wife was always the orderly one." He rubbed his temples. "Strange thing, though. I found a set of keys she never mentioned. One labeled for a bank box in London. I can't imagine what she kept there." Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her mind sharpened. A bank box. Of course, that was where Lawrence's leverage had been all along. Not in St. Mary Mead at all. She left quietly, walking back through the dusk. The case wasn't over. Not really. Mrs. Richards had been willing to kill, yes, but she had also been a shield, whether she knew it or not. Lawrence had stayed invisible, letting his sister take the fall, slipping away with whatever he wanted. Miss Marple looked at the horizon, her knitting bag under her arm. She doubted she would see Lawrence again. Men like him were like smoke. They left a faint trace of scent, a memory of fire, and nothing solid to hold. But she also knew something else, as sure as she knew her rose garden would bloom next spring. Smoke always lingers somewhere. And when the time was right, Lawrence Richards' trail would curl back into the open. Until then, she would wait. The morning air over St. Mary Mead carried the smell of freshly cut grass, as if the village itself was eager to wash away the memory of scandal. But in Miss Marple's cozy sitting room, the air was still as Inspector Craythorne leaned forward, puzzled. "I don't mind admitting, Miss Marple, this business with Mrs. Richards sits oddly with me. All fits neatly enough, but I can't shake the feeling. Well, that something's missing." Miss Marple poured his tea, adding the precise amount of sugar she knew he preferred. "Something or someone is missing, Inspector, and that someone is Lawrence Richards." Craythorne sat back, frowning. "The dead brother? Surely." "Oh, no," Miss Marple said mildly, her needles clicking. "Lawrence is very much alive. Alive and clever enough to have let his sister shoulder the blame. You see, she had the right motive, yes, but not the means for certain things. The keys to Allenby's private safe, for example, were never in her possession. Nor could she have intercepted Davies's letter in time to destroy or replace it. Someone else arranged for it to be delivered. Someone who knew exactly how it would appear." Craythorne frowned deeper. "You're suggesting the letter that damned her wasn't entirely genuine?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. "Oh, it was genuine in its handwriting. But the contents. I imagine poor Mr. Davies wrote 2 drafts, one perhaps altered before posting. A very old trick. The question is, who would have had the opportunity? Only someone who moved in and out of the village quietly, known only as a ghost from the past. Lawrence Richards had every reason to ensure his name stayed unmentioned." The inspector rubbed his chin. "And he's long gone now." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "Gone, with whatever he retrieved from the bank box his sister so conveniently kept. Mrs. Richards's trial will satisfy the papers, and perhaps even the court, but true justice, well, it has a habit of lagging behind." Craythorne shook his head. "I hate to think of it, him walking free." Miss Marple smiled faintly, not unkindly. "My dear Inspector, the cleverest criminals often do, but life has a way of catching up. Men like Lawrence Richards leave a trail, even if it takes years to see where it leads. In the meantime," she patted her knitting bag, "we must be patient." Craythorne rose, half frustrated, half impressed. "One day, Miss Marple, I'd like to see the world as you do." Miss Marple looked out her window at the garden, the roses nodding in the light breeze. "It's just a matter of keeping one's eyes open, Inspector, and knowing that justice, like a rose, sometimes blooms later than expected." He left with a respectful nod, the case officially closed. But Miss Marple, left alone with her tea, knew better. Justice had not yet been served, only delayed. Somewhere out there, Lawrence Richards was living comfortably on secrets and stolen safety. But she also knew one other thing, as sure as she knew her own garden. His day would come. And when it did, she would be ready. The evening light slanted across St. Mary Mead, gilding the rooftops and hedgerows in soft gold. The village seemed peaceful again, as it always did once scandal had passed. Faces returned to their usual smiles, the market bustled, and gossip thinned to a comfortable hum. Miss Marple strolled back from the vicarage, her knitting bag tucked neatly over her arm. On the surface, All was settled. Mrs. Richards awaited her trial. The police had filed their reports. Inspector Craythorne had returned to London, somewhat reluctantly, with the official conclusion in his pocket. But Miss Marple's mind was far from quiet. The path to her cottage took her past the churchyard, and she paused by the lich gate, her eyes resting on the weathered stones. One in particular caught her attention, not for the name, but for what lay at its base. A small folded scrap of paper, weighed down by a smooth river stone. She bent to retrieve it, her fingers as nimble as when she had once mended a torn glove for a careless niece. The paper was plain, the writing elegant. "Until next time, Jane." L.R. Miss Marple's lips tightened, though her eyes held the faintest trace of a smile. She slipped the note into her knitting bag, continuing her walk without the slightest alteration in pace. Her garden was a picture of domestic tranquility when she arrived. Roses blooming, the kettle just beginning to sing in the kitchen. She set the bag down, humming faintly as she prepared her tea. But as she settled into her chair, she let her thoughts drift, not to the flowers or the day's errands, but to Lawrence Richards. He was alive, clever, and arrogant enough to leave her a note. A taunt, yes, but also a promise. She glanced toward the mantel, where her collection of neatly labeled case notes rested in orderly files. A new folder would be added tonight, its tab marked Richards, Lawrence, unfinished. As she sipped her tea, the village beyond her garden fence laughed and gossiped as if the world had righted itself. And in a way, it had. But Miss Marple knew better than anyone that justice was never as tidy as the police reports claimed. She took up her knitting once more, her needles moving in quiet, patient rhythm. Somewhere, out in the world, a clever man was already weaving the next thread of mischief. And somewhere, inevitably, that thread would tangle, leading back to St. Mary Mead, or to her. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. After all, a mystery never ends. The village had settled into that uneasy calm that always follows a second tragedy. The death of Mr. Davies left St. Mary Mead in a hush. Doors shut earlier in the evening, voices lowered, the usual gossip subdued to murmurs. Miss Marple walked the lane as she so often did, stopping now and again to pass a remark about roses or to inquire after a grandchild. It was a walk that seemed idle to anyone watching, but her mind was working with quiet precision. In the post office, Mrs. Pringle was sorting letters, grumbling softly about misdelivered mail. "And here's another oddity," she said, holding up a forwarding slip. "A note for Mrs. Richards redirected to London last month. Funny thing is, she never mentioned any trip." Miss Marple's brows rose slightly, though her voice stayed mild. "How curious. I suppose it could have been business of the vicarage." Mrs. Pringle sniffed. "Could be, but she's not one to forget a detail like that." Miss Marple tucked the remark away, adding it to her growing mental list. A forwarded letter, a Queen of Hearts tucked in a book, a change of plans that kept Mrs. Richards conveniently away from the vestry on the morning Davies died. Back home, Miss Marple set her knitting in her lap and reviewed her notes. Each crime, she saw now, was accompanied by the quiet displacement of something small. A card, a letter, a sum of money, a person's presence. They were never the main event, they were the shadows cast by the hand that moved them. It came to her, quite suddenly, as she poured her tea. The pattern wasn't in the grand gestures, but in the tidying, the careful sweeping aside of anything that might draw the eye. Allenby's desk, Davies' papers, even the missing letters from the station drawer. This was someone who knew that the way to commit the perfect crime was not to hide the act itself, but to arrange the surroundings so neatly that no one thought to look deeper. And who in St. Mary Mead was better at that than Mrs. Richards? The vicarage ran with the smoothness of a well-oiled clock, papers filed, doors locked, appointments arranged and rearranged with quiet efficiency. Her absence from the vestry on the day of the second murder was not luck, Miss Marple realized, but precision. Miss Marple leaned back, her eyes soft but alert. The key had been there from the beginning, in plain sight, hidden in the habits everyone took for granted. It was like one of her old lace patterns, the true design only visible when viewed at a distance. Now she could see the shape clearly, and soon she would have to decide how to weave her own threads to close it in. The evening was heavy with the scent of lilac when Miss Marple called at the vicarage. The vicar answered the door himself, his face lined from sleepless nights, his voice quieter than usual. He ushered her into the study almost absently, apologizing for the disorder. Books lay open on the desk, correspondence half sorted, a half-packed trunk in the corner. "I'm afraid things have been difficult," he said with a weary smile. "My wife has been unwell since her arrest. She spends her hours writing letters. Most of them she burns. I can't imagine to whom she writes or why." Miss Marple's eyes flicked to the hearth, where traces of burnt paper still clung to the grate. "Grief takes many forms, Mr. Richards. It can bring back old matters we thought were long laid to rest." The vicar hesitated, then sighed. "There is one thing I've never told anyone here. My wife, she had a brother, Lawrence. Years ago, he was involved in some scandal with a shipping company. Fraud, I believe. She cut all ties after the trial. I've never been certain if he survived the disgrace. But she never truly escaped it." Miss Marple felt the pieces shift and click into place. The motive was not simply greed or panic over some recent quarrel. It reached back decades into the shadowed roots of Mrs. Richards' life. Allenby had been a solicitor, precisely the sort of man who might have handled the wreckage of Lawrence Richards' affairs. Davies, meanwhile, had been digging into old estate accounts for the parish, perhaps uncovering a record that hinted at the same name. If those truths surfaced, Mrs. Richards' carefully built respectability would have collapsed in an instant. The life she had crafted, the vicarage, her position in the parish, the secure facade, would all have been swept away. This was not murder in a fit of rage. It was the work of someone who had lived for years with a gnawing fear, who had learned to arrange her world so that nothing from the past could intrude. Miss Marple saw now how inevitable the killings must have seemed to her. Not for gain, but for survival. The survival of the life she had built, the identity she had fought to preserve. It was, in its way, the most chilling motive of all, not because it was senseless, but because it made perfect sense to the one who acted. Miss Marple rose to leave, her mind sharper than her gentle expression. The truth was clear. What remained now was to bring it into the open, carefully, before Mrs. Richards decided to act one last time to preserve it. The day Miss Marple chose for the confrontation was deceptively pleasant. Clear blue skies, a soft breeze, and a quietness in the village that suggested nothing amiss. She arrived at the vicarage in the late afternoon, a basket of scones on her arm, looking every inch the benign parishioner come to offer comfort. The vicar greeted her politely but distractedly, explaining that his wife was in the sitting room. Miss Marple thanked him and, with her usual unobtrusive grace, stepped inside. Mrs. Richards was seated at her writing desk, her pen moving steadily over a sheet of paper. She looked up at Miss Marple with a composed smile. "What a thoughtful surprise. I'm afraid my appetite hasn't been what it used to be." "I quite understand," Miss Marple said, placing the basket neatly on the side table. She took a seat opposite Mrs. Richards, hands folded neatly in her lap. "I thought we might have a little chat. I've been thinking about poor Mr. Allenby and dear Mr. Davies, and it seems to me we've all overlooked something important." Mrs. Richards' eyes flickered, but her smile remained fixed. The police seemed satisfied with their conclusions. "Ah, yes," Miss Marple said, her tone gentle. "They often are. But I've noticed how very good you are at tidying things. Papers, schedules, even inconvenient little details. That is what drew my attention. Mrs. Richards's pen paused mid-stroke. You see, Miss Marple continued, the pattern was always there, so precise, so careful. Your absences at just the right moments, the missing letters, the careful removal of anything that might point to the past. One could almost admire it. Mrs. Richards set her pen down slowly. Admire, Miss Marple? Surely you aren't accusing me of... Miss Marple's expression was serene. Not accusing, my dear. Merely observing. And of course, pointing out that the matter of Lawrence Richards is bound to come to light sooner or later. Secrets have a way of slipping through even the neatest of hands. For the first time, Mrs. Richards's composure faltered. A tightness crept into her voice. You don't know what it is to live every day with the threat of ruin over you. To have everything you've built threatened by one careless word. Miss Marple's voice softened. On the contrary, I know very well what it is to protect those you love. But the difference, my dear, is that protection cannot come at the cost of two men's lives. The air in the room felt charged, as though the walls themselves were listening. Mrs. Richards's gaze darted briefly toward the side door, only to catch sight of Inspector Craythorne stepping quietly into view. Her shoulders straightened, the brittle poise of someone who knows the game is over. You've been very clever, Miss Marple, but you cannot possibly prove... The proof, Miss Marple said gently, is in the pattern, and you have woven it yourself. For a long moment, Mrs. Richards stood very still. Then, in a voice so low it was almost a whisper, she said, I only wanted to keep my life. Everything else was... necessary. Craythorne stepped forward, but Miss Marple simply gathered her knitting bag, her expression tinged with sadness. The trap had sprung, not with violence, but with inevitability. As Mrs. Richards was led away, Miss Marple stepped into the golden light of the garden, her heart heavy but her mind certain. The pattern was complete. The vicarage had fallen silent after Mrs. Richards was taken away. The village, relieved and a little self-satisfied, went back to its familiar routine. Church on Sunday, market gossip on Monday, tea and small scandal on Tuesday. To all appearances, the case was settled. Miss Marple should have felt the same sense of closure, but there was a pebble in her mind that would not sit still. 3 days after Mrs. Richards' arrest, she received a letter. The envelope bore no return address, but the handwriting was elegant, measured, and unfamiliar. She slit it open over her tea and read, Dear Miss Marple, your attention to detail does you credit, but you have caught only half of the truth. My sister was clever, yes, but not that clever. Without me, there would have been no Allenby affair, no vestry tea, no careful erasures of the past. Do not trouble yourself to search. By the time you read this, I am far away. Until next time. L.R. Miss Marple set the letter down and stared for a long moment at her rose-patterned teacup. Lawrence Richards. Alive. Watching. Moving unseen while his sister took the fall. She thought back to the convenient letter from Davies that had sealed Mrs. Richards's fate. It had seemed perfect. Too perfect. A careful net of evidence had formed, one that matched the inspector's expectations exactly. And who better to arrange such a thing than someone who had already slipped past the law once? The sister had acted, yes, but she had not been alone. That afternoon, Miss Marple strolled past the vicarage to deliver a pot of soup to the vicar. His study was in disarray, papers half-packed, drawers gaping. I'm sorting what my wife left behind, he said heavily, though I keep finding odd things. Keys I never saw before. One labelled for a bank in London. Miss Marple's mind sharpened like a blade. A bank box, of course. Lawrence's connection had never been broken. His sister had been a shield, not the architect. She left the vicarage as dusk crept over the lane. In her cottage, She slipped Lawrence's letter into a fresh folder, marked neatly. Richards, Lawrence. Unfinished. The case was not truly closed. Lawrence had escaped again, but Miss Marple knew something he did not. Patterns always repeat, and when his next one began, she would be ready. The morning sun fell warmly over St. Mary Mead, bathing the village in deceptive tranquility. At her cottage table, Miss Marple was pouring tea for Inspector Craythorne, who had returned from London to tidy up the Allenby Davies matter once and for all. He stirred his tea with a frown. "I can't help it, Miss Marple. Everything lines up neatly enough against Mrs. Richards, but it feels too neat. You've the look of someone who shares my unease." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly. "Indeed, Inspector, the truth of it is, Mrs. Richards was guilty, yes, but not alone. The true author of the play has already taken his bow and left thee." Stage Craythorne leaned forward. "You're speaking of Lawrence Richards. You think he's alive?" "I know he is," Miss Marple said mildly, as though remarking on the weather. "And I know he was here. Consider the letter from Mr. Davies, which arrived at exactly the right moment to seal Mrs. Richards' fate. Its arrival was too timely, its contents too polished, a solicitor's draft altered, perhaps, by another hand, one that knew just enough to make it appear authentic." Craythorne's brows knit. "So Mrs. Richards took the fall?" "She took the part she'd rehearsed all her life," Miss Marple corrected gently. "Her habits of tidying, of managing others' affairs, of disappearing at just the right moment, these were convenient. But Lawrence, he arranged the stage, the missing records from Allenby's desk, the erased connections in the vestry files, even the misdirected correspondence to London. They were beyond her reach, but not beyond his." The inspector sighed. "And now?" Miss Marple gave him a small, almost pitying smile. "Now he's gone. Justice, I'm afraid, has been served only in part, but such men do not live quietly. They have a way of leaving threads trailing behind them, threads that someone patient enough can follow." Craythorne shook his head, half admiring, half frustrated. "I sometimes think you take more comfort in an unfinished case than a finished one." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. "Oh no, Inspector, but I know that justice does not always arrive on schedule. It is like a perennial. If you plant it carefully, it blooms in time." Craythorne finished his tea and rose, still troubled, but visibly calmer. "If Richards resurfaces, I hope I'm there when he does, though I suspect you'll know before I do." Miss Marple walked him to the door, the sunlight catching the faint smile at the corner of her lips. When she returned to her table, she slipped Lawrence Richards' taunting letter back into its folder. It sat neatly on her shelf among her other cases. Not closed, merely waiting. Justice had not the days after Mrs. Richards' arrest slipped quietly into the familiar rhythm of St. Mary Mead. The market reopened to its full chatter, the vicar returned to his sermons, more subdued but steady, and the matter of Allenby and Davies was spoken of less and less, like a storm that had blown over. Miss Marple, walking home one late afternoon, felt the peace of the village settle over her like an old shawl. And yet she knew better than anyone that still water often concealed the strongest currents. She paused at the lich gate of the churchyard, the same way she often did. The fading sun painted the headstones gold. Something unusual caught her eye at the base of one stone, an ordinary enough grave except for a small, flat river stone resting neatly on top of it. Beneath the stone was a folded scrap of paper. Miss Marple glanced about. No one lingered nearby. She picked up the note, unfolding it with the quiet precision of someone who had done this sort of thing before. The handwriting was elegant, measured. Some patterns take years to complete. Until we meet again. L.R. Miss Marple refolded the note, slipped it into her knitting bag, and replaced the stone exactly as it had been. Her face was calm, her expression almost placid, as though she had merely paused to admire the church roses. Back at her cottage, she set the note beside her case file marked Richards, Lawrence, unfinished. She made no exclamation, no gesture of surprise. Instead, she sat by her window with her tea and her knitting, watching the last light fade over the hedgerows. Somewhere, far from St. Mary Mead, Lawrence Richards was still moving his pieces. Somewhere, another pattern was already beginning, and when it reached its end, whether in a year or a decade, Miss Marple would be ready to see it. Because in her quiet heart, she knew a simple truth. A mystery never ends. Aped. It was simply biding its time.